This program is presented by the Fromm Institute for Lifelong Learning at the University of San Francisco. The Fromm Institute, keeping up with the times, no matter when.
And I think we're ready to go. It's always a challenge. The first talk or two in a course that lasts for 8 weeks, how to help students get their arms around the subject matter, whatever it may be. And I want to take 2 sessions this week and next week to kind of help all of us get our arms around this amazing musician who has left such a treasure for us to study, to enjoy, and in a way to inspire our lives. So this week, I'm doing a presentation which I'm calling Leonard Bernstein, A Life in Music. And I'm going to take time to kind of go through decade by decade so that we kind of have an understanding of the arc of his life, of his person, and certainly of his music. Then next week, it will be Leonard Bernstein in the words of others. People have written to him, people have written about him, and I think it's very helpful to go back and listen to many of those words to help us illuminate this man, to help us get our arms around him. So are you ready? It's the first day of classes. Are your pencils sharpened? Ready to go? Okay, we're moving now to Leonard Bernstein, A Life in Music. My hope today is that as we go through all of this information, we have the ability to get his life in perspective, and we'll do it, as you can see here, by decades, to get some samples of his writing, to get some samples of his conducting, and some samples of his teaching. So that when we end today, hopefully you have been exposed maybe to something you never heard before, or had a thought about this man that you'd not had before, or you've heard music that is so familiar to you that it brings back a time in your life when you encountered it for the very first time. The powerful music and presence of Leonard Bernstein. He remains a force for us today, even though he has been dead more than 20 years. A Life in Music by the decades. So we start from those very, very early years. Born in 1918, he was the first child of Jenny and Sam Bernstein, and they lived in Lawrence, Massachusetts. He wrote about his dad this. He said, "My father is a very complicated human being, a man of irregular temperament and unusual convictions. He is a rare combination of the shrewd businessman and ardent religionist." He was quite a Zionist. He was also, Bernstein's dad, an opponent to Leonard Bernstein ever going into music. And so there always was a strain between the two of them. His mother, on the other hand, really sort of gave a warm, embracing, supportive household. And she appreciated what her son was able to do. And in a sense, he flourished growing up in that home. Some of his earliest piano lessons were with a woman named Helen Coates, Miss Coates. She charged $6 an hour for piano lessons when he started out with her. And she was close to him for more than 50 years because he hired her as his assistant, and she helped him through many a crisis, through many a situation in his life. I love this little note here. "Dear Lenny, bravo 1,000 times. A lovely composition and a grand performance. I'm increasingly fond of my conductor. I'm just off to a cocktail party, so I'll drink one to you and a long, brilliant career for you. Love with much pride, Helen." After high school, he enrolled at Harvard He was at Harvard. He graduated in 1939 as a cum laude graduate. While he was there, he was immersed in music. He directed operas. He directed stage productions and concerts. This is where he met, at this time of his life, Dmitri Mitropoulos, the conductor. He also met and ultimately became very close friends with Aaron Copland. He was involved in 3 basic educational institutions in his life. As a student at Harvard, then he went on to the Curtis Institute of Music, where he studied piano and he studied conducting under Fritz Reiner. At Harvard, he studied with Randall Thompson, who was his orchestration teacher. And then in the summer of 1940, he spent his first of many, many summers at the Tanglewood Center in Lenox, Massachusetts. And here, as I say, he worked with Copland. He also worked with Sergei Koussevitzky and met the wonderful composer Lucas Voss. I thought it might be interesting to take just a moment and explore the very first piece that he got published. This was a sonata for clarinet and piano. It was written during 1941, 1942. He was 23 years old, and it's his first published piece. And it's dedicated to the clarinetist David Oppenheim, whom Bernstein met when he was studying with Koussevitzky at Tanglewood in 1940 and 41. What I want to play for you is a bit of the second movement, because I think it embodies what we're going to experience as we move through Bernstein's life and all of his compositions. The second movement has this beautiful, tranquil opening where there are snippets of melody that emerge, and there's a wonderful dialogue with the piano. But then, by contrast, there's a central section that is filled, just utterly filled with high rhythmic energy. It really will remind you of some of the things that were to come 17 years later, 16 years later, with, for example, West Side Story. And we have this just dance-like, multi-metered section in the middle. And this is a kind of dialectic, it seems to me, of his life. In this performance is a really special clarinetist. It's Stanley Drucker. He was the principal clarinet with the New York Philharmonic for 60 seasons, and he was with Leonard Bernstein for his entire tenure. Here is Leonard Bernstein's first published piece. Music by the 23-year-old Leonard Bernstein, his first published piece. And here is that wonderful set of contrasts between the rhythmic energy of the middle section and the lyrical energy of the slow part that surrounds it. And we also see his love of melody and his ability to explore way out beyond the reaches of really, even at that point in his life, of what people were accustomed to. This is the early years of Leonard Bernstein, but now we move on to the 1940s. And after receiving his diploma in conducting from the Curtis Institute, he went back to Harvard. He conducted a number of concerts there, and then spent several beginning summers actually at Tanglewood, and people greatly, he was there as a student, and people just, they knew they were encountering someone very special. But in 1943, he was appointed the assistant conductor of the New York Philharmonic, and in that role, an amazing event happened on November 14th, 1943. He made his conducting debut with the New York Philharmonic on short notice. He heard about it the morning of it. He had no rehearsal, because the guest conductor, Bruno Walter, had come down with the flu, and he, as you see from the program here, he conducted Schumann and Rocha and Strauss and Wagner. And the next day, the New York Times carried the story about this young guy conducting the New York Philharmonic on short notice, and it was on the front page and also mentioned in an editorial. They said, quote, "It's a good American success story. The warm, friendly triumph of it filled Carnegie Hall and spread far over the airwaves." It was also broadcast. And he wrote this wonderful little note to the musicians afterwards. He said, "To the New York Philharmonic Society, in deepest gratitude for giving me my great opportunity." Many newspapers throughout the country carried the story, and then it was broadcast, as I said, on the CBS network, and it really propelled him in a way to kind of instant fame. And over the next 2 years of the late 1940s, he made conducting debuts with 10 different orchestras in the United States and Canada. He studied new repertoire, and he loved to conduct concertos from the piano, and he sort of got into that mode during these late years of the 1940s. He was invited, in terms of conducting, to go back to Tanglewood, and he conducted the U.S. premiere of Benjamin Britten's opera, Peter Grimes, which had been commissioned by Serge Koussevitzky. Again, he was 28 years old conducting Benjamin Britten, and that same year, Arturo Toscanini invited him to guest conduct 2 concerts with the renowned NBC, with the NBC Symphony Orchestra. There were 3 major conductors who influenced him. One was Koussevitzky, and he says this about him: "I wish you all could have heard that beautiful little piece conducted by Koussevitzky, and the same magic he brought to it, he brought to everything he did, especially his teaching. He got through to his pupils by simply inspiring them. He taught everything through feeling, through instinct and emotion." Hang on to that. "Even the purely mechanical matter of beating time, of conducting 4 beats in a bar, became an emotional experience, not a mathematical one." The other one was Fritz Reiner, with whom he studied, and Fritz Reiner was the exact opposite of Koussevitzky. Again, here's Bernstein saying, "Reiner didn't use the inspirational method of Koussevitzky. There were no poetic speeches about the warm sun. There was only hard work, impossibly high standards of knowledge, and the all-important law of economy. Every gesture must be concentrated on getting the orchestra to produce the sound you want. No, the sound the composer wants." Dmitri Mitropoulos, a generation or so older than he, conducted the Boston Symphony and conducted in Minneapolis, and then preceded Leonard Bernstein at the New York Philharmonic. Bernstein loved to quote him when he said, "Never sleep in a bed that's too soft." And all of this time, he was trying to earn a bit more of a living, and he took a job as at a music publisher's house, part of Warner Brothers at the time, and he worked as an assistant and an occasional an arranger, and he used the name Lenny Amber. Bernstein means amber. He was also very productive as a composer at this time, and this is where the first time he hooks up with the choreographer, the director, Jerry Robbins, and they come together to create a ballet, their first collaboration, a ballet called Fancy Free. And it's a ballet about three young sailors who were on leave during wartime in New York City. It premiered in 1944 with what is now the American Ballet Theater at the old Metropolitan Opera House. But then they decided they wanted to expand this into a musical. They invited Adolph Green and Betty Comden to help write the book and the lyrics for this show. And On the Town opened on Broadway in December of 1944, so right towards the end of the war. And it resonated with audiences during this wartime. And it did another interesting thing I learned. It broke race barriers on Broadway. We think that Hamilton is such a groundbreaking experience, and yet On the Town, in its own quiet way, did some of the very same things. It broke some of the race barriers on Broadway. A Japanese American dancer, Sono Osato, was one of the leading men. It was a multiracial cast with mixed races and couples dancing together. There was a concertmaster of the orchestra who was black, Everett Lee, and he eventually became the music director of the show. Here's, during the revival a couple of years ago, here was their performance at the Grammys, at the Tonys.
Come on, Jamie! 24 hours!
Hey, why don't you look where you're going? You think it was your first time in New York?
It is! New York, New York, New York! It's a hell of a town! We've got one day here and not another minute to see the famous sights.
We'll find no romance and danger waiting in it beneath the Broadway lights.
We've hair on our chest, so what we let the best of the nights. Sights, New York, New York, a hell of a town. The Bronx is up, but the battery's down. The people riding the holy ground. New York, New York, New York. It's a hell of a town.
It's interesting, Serge Koussevitzky, with whom he was very close as his teacher, his mentor in many parts of his life, he thought that he should not be writing musical theater, that it was totally a waste of his talents. And it hit home. Bernstein did not write another musical until after Koussevitzky's death in 1951. But a couple of other things happened in the 1940s. Bernstein was able to go to Israel in 1948, and the experience of being in Israel was a very, very powerful force in his life. Early, before 1948, in 1942, he had written a symphony called the Jeremiah Symphony, in which he attempts to go back, and not go back, he claims, he holds on to and presents the powerful Jewish roots that he retained throughout his whole life. It's interesting, the Jeremiah Symphony, one of the three symphonies, is a fascinating take. He wrote it in 1942, and it's a fascinating take of going back and claiming his Jewish heritage. Here is Tony Pappano, American conductor, who is the musical director at Covent Garden, describing the Jeremiah Symphony.
I think his symphonies are a wonderful picture of him, complete. The Jeremiah Symphony, written in 1942, it commemorates a great moment in Jewish history, the destruction of the first temple in Jerusalem. The first movement, Prophecy, is a picture of somehow the pleading of Jeremiah with his people. The second movement, Profanation, is about the chaos and confusion, and it's a very quite aggressive and busy piece of music having to do with corruption, the corruption of the people. And then we have the last movement, the Lamentation, featuring the mezzo-soprano soloist, singing the words of Jeremiah from the Lamentations.
One of the things that I've learned in my study recently, or I've really thought more about, that almost all of his music is story-based. There's a kind of narrative. In instrumental music that has no words whatsoever, there is still, in the ballet music that we're going to explore in a few minutes, there is story. And Bernstein sees a way of music being able to tell a story in a more powerful way than just using the words. The 1940s, a lot happened. But when we turn to the 1950s, we're going to encounter an amazing set of events. Actually, at a party given in the late 1940s by Claudio Arau, he met a beautiful woman, Felicia Montealegre. And in the course of the next year, they grew closer and closer, and by the end, they were engaged, and they got married in 1951. It was a very rocky marriage. We're going to talk about it a little bit more next week. The birth of their youngest child, Jamie, in 1952 sort of seemed to cement the relationship, at least for a while. Again, the 1950s, he becomes conductor of the New York Philharmonic. Aaron Copland had joked with him a few years before. He said, Lenny, 40 years from now, when you are conductor of the New York Philharmonic. Well, it only took 18 years for Bernstein to become music director. And they toured throughout the world. They made hundreds of recordings, a staggering number of concerts. In 1971, for example, he conducted his 1,000th concert with the New York Philharmonic. There were many tours. Tours resulted frequently in sort of encounters, personal encounters. He recalled how in 1959, when they were touring the Soviet Union, he met Boris Pasternak at a time when Pasternak had been denounced by the Soviet authorities for Dr. Zhivago. And they became friends, and for the rest of his life, Bernstein cherished the letters that they exchanged after their meetings. We also need to remember that in the 1950s, we had this man on our set in our sites, Joe McCarthy. And Leonard Bernstein was one of more than 150 names in the entertainment industry whose communist associations were chronicled under suspicion. There were prominent figures in music: Aaron Copland, Lena Horne, Pete Seeger, Artie Shaw. All of them were named publicly as suspected communist sympathizers. And then there was a publication called Red Channels, the report of communist influence in radio and television. And Bernstein's name appeared on that, mainly through his affiliation with a committee to re-elect a man named Benjamin Davis, who was a socialist, to the New York City Council. He was on the list. But there was so much music that came out of the 1950s. The piece, of course, that sort of stands as the tent post for all of this is West Side Story, which we will deal with in a few weeks. But there were other shows, other dramatic presentations that occurred. He wrote just before West Side Story. He had written Candide in 1956. In 1952, he had written the opera Trouble in Tahiti, which focuses on domestic conflict between a young couple who are terribly unhappy. Interesting, he chooses this. And beneath their marital discord is sort of, they're longing somehow to find love and intimacy between them. There's a kind of emptiness in the world that is around them. Welcome to the 1950s. And then he also dedicated this to his dearest friend, Mark Blitzstein, composer. We're going to discuss him a little later on. He had led him really into musical theater and into opera. And we can't forget the 1954 film On the Waterfront that starred Marlon Brando. But there was another whole different thing, media-wise, that happened this year, and that was Bernstein's taking to this new medium of television. We'll come back to that in just a moment, but I want to go back now to Candide and just play for you one aria. This is an aria that is sung by Cunegonde, and it shows the versatility of Bernstein's ability to write really an operatic aria, but to do it slightly in jest and slightly to have fun. This is Glitter and Be Gay with June Anderson. Note the virtuosity of the writing.
First
1956, a year before West Side Story, and here is Bernstein having the courage, in a way, in a Broadway musical, to go towards opera, which we certainly see when it comes to West Side Story as well. Well, I mentioned that this was also a time when the Omnibus TV series came along. It was sponsored by the Ford Foundation, and it wanted to increase education among the American public. And the Omnibus series would usually be broadcast live, primarily on a Sunday afternoon around 4 o'clock on the East Coast. And it started in 1952 and lasted all the way to 1961. And Alistair Cook, you may remember him, was the host. It was his American TV debut, and it was diverse programming, some about science, some of the arts, and the humanities. And Bernstein gave his very first televised music lectures on this program. Actually, he also conducted one of the earliest telecasts of excerpts from Handel's Messiah on the Omnibus series. Here's Leonard Bernstein describing what a recitative is.
Now, just how does a plot get furthered by music? Well, there are a number of ways. There's ballet, underscoring, choral devices, and so on. But certainly the most common technique for telling your story musically is the device known as recitativo, or recitativo, or however you want to pronounce it, a word which you certainly know as somehow connected with opera, but perhaps are a bit foggy about. What is this recitative, anyway? Well, let's suppose that I'm in a musical show whose plot calls upon me to inform my wife that chicken has gone up 3 cents a pound. Now, in an ordinary show, I would simply say to her, "Dear, chicken is up 3 cents a pound," and then my wife would probably burst forth into a lament about the high cost of living. But in an opera, I would sing my line, and so I would have to resort to recitative, let's say in the style of Mozart, like this. Susanna, I have something terrible to tell you. I've just been talking to the butcher, and he tells me that the price of chicken has gone up 3 cents a pound. Please don't be too depressed, dear. Now, that's not terribly expressive. It's rather close to plain speech, except for an intermittent piano chord, and it's not particularly descriptive of my feelings about chicken. But of course, I could get more dramatic in the style of Verdi, something like this. Gilda, il prezzo di pollo è montato, 3 soldi per grammo. Now, if Wagner had been concerned with the high price of chicken, he might have put it this way. But no matter how expressive I get, the function of my recitative is only to set up the situation for my wife's song. In other words, to further the plot through music.
Here we see him in all of his glory, way back in the 1950s on Omnibus. His ability, first of all, to conceive of a subject that might interest people or that they don't understand, and then to make it totally understandable and apparent to the listener. And that gets coupled with this supreme musical ability to be able to range through all of the scores that he was able to do, to memorize them, and then to be able to translate them and transfer them into the keyboard. Very, very unique coming together of a brilliant mind, an understanding of storytelling and who his audience is, coupled with phenomenal musical gifts. The 1950s were where he really, everything gelled and began to come together. And then we turn now to the 1960s. And of course, John Kennedy, his inauguration. Bernstein was very close to the Kennedy family. He was a guest at the White House on a number of occasions. And Frank Sinatra was producing a big gala on the eve of the inauguration in 1961 at the National Guard Armory in Washington. And they decided to have a 70-piece band, and they wanted Bernstein to compose a fanfare. And this is what it sounded like. I hear lots of Charles Ives in that. And again, you have, first of all, you have the highly rhythmicized, and he loves the meter of 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. That permeates the piece we're going to hear in just a moment. The same thing. He loved that particular uneven meter. But also that you have this dialectic of the brass band playing a march while something else is going on around it. And he manages through his gifts to really pull it off. He wrote a letter to his friend John Gruen in 1967, and he said, "I've written 2 works in the last 10 years. Can you imagine, since I took over with the New York Philharmonic?" Which is the point, he says, where I finished West Side Story. Since then, I've written 2 major works, neither of them for the theater. One was Kaddish, and the other one was Chichester Psalms. They're both, he says, they're both biblical in a way. So obviously, something keeps making me go back to that book, and go back, he did on a number of occasions. The dean of Chichester Cathedral in England wrote, along with John Birch, who was the director of music, they wrote Leonard Bernstein and in the early 60s. And they wrote him this. They said, "The Chichester organist and I are very anxious to have written some piece of music which the combined choirs could sing at our festival to be held in 1965. And we do wonder if you would be willing to, if you would be willing to write something for us. I do realize how enormously busy you are, but if you could manage to do this, we should be tremendously honored and grateful." I love British politeness. Well, Bernstein took on the challenge. He arranged from the Book of Psalms in their original Hebrew, setting 3 different movements of this piece. It was premiered at Philharmonic Hall in July of '65, and then another performance at the Cathedral a little bit later on. The text is, "Make a joyful noise to the Lord, serve the Lord with gladness, come before his presence with singing, know that the Lord, he is God." A little snippet of Chichester Psalms, and watch for that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 beat that pops up. Chichester Psalms premiered 1965 with the New York Philharmonic and then performed later at Chichester Cathedral in England. And in the 1960s, there was another phenomenon that happened, and that was for Leonard Bernstein and for all of us. And that was, in a sense, the rediscovery of the music of Gustav Mahler. In 1960, Bernstein and the New York Philharmonic held a Mahler festival to mark the centenary of the composer's birth. And both Bernstein conducted, Bruno Walter conducted, Dmitri Mitropoulos conducted performances. Even Alma Mahler, the composer's widow, attended some of the rehearsals for it. And in 1960, Leonard Bernstein also made his first commercial recording of a Mahler symphony, of the Fourth. And over the next 7 years, he completed a cycle of all 9 Mahler's completed symphonies. And the success of this, along with his concert performances and his talks about Mahler on television, they were really vital to, in a sense, a revival of interest in Gustav Mahler in the 1960s, especially in the United States. Someone has said that, in a sense, Leonard Bernstein was a composer's composer. He identified so much with Gustav Mahler, and you'll notice here he made 3 complete sets of the recordings of symphonies of Gustav Mahler during the course of his lifetime. I must say that in 1960, I was probably totally unaware of the music of Gustav Mahler, and it took an event at St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York City where I heard this wondrous music coming from the balcony in the middle of the funeral for Robert F. Kennedy. And it was the Adagietto of Mahler's Fifth Symphony. We need to visit it for just a moment today. Well, as an early 20-something kid, witnessing that moment and hearing that music was an astounding moment for me musically in my life. And I wasn't the only person who felt that way. It's interesting, after the funeral was over, Jacqueline Kennedy wrote to Leonard Bernstein the following words. "When your Mahler started to fill," but that is the wrong word, she says, because it was more this sensitive trembling, the cathedral today. "I thought it the most beautiful music I had ever heard. I am so glad I didn't know it. It was this strange music of all the gods who were crying. And then, if only you could have seen it, it was the time when Ethel had the thought of the most touching thing, having the littlest nephews and nieces, small children, before that terrifying array of cardinals and gold and Gothic vaults, carry all the little vessels for communion up to the high altar so that they could have some part in the farewell to the uncle they all loved so much. They were so vulnerable, and your music was everything in my heart of peace and pain and such drowning beauty. You could close your eyes and be lost in it forever." Leonard Bernstein understood Mahler in a way few people ever have. And to know that that was the piece to do at that moment in our nation's history was very typical of him. And we'll encounter a number of events like that where Leonard Bernstein and society come together, and it is music that brings us together. Okay, well, we're going to take just a short break now. We'll have a couple of minutes, and I suggest you stand up, stretch for a moment, and I'll be back in 3 or 4 minutes, and off we go. Welcome. You're still there. Hello, everybody. I took a moment and I glanced at the chat section, and a number of you have commented and written. Please do that. It's one way where we can at least find some form of communication in this digital age. So give me a second, and we'll come back onto my screen share. Okay, so we've begun to see how Bernstein was majorly connected in a way to the world in which he lived, and he was a kind of moral force and a moral leader, but he also was somebody in popular culture. Take this, for example.
What time is it, Betty?
It's 10 minutes to 9.
That does it. Come on, Betty, we're leaving without the boys.
Well, don't you think we ought to wait 5 more minutes?
Not on your life. I don't want to miss 1 minute of this concert. I love to watch Leonard Bernstein conduct.
And the first thing on the program is that gorgeous symphony by Rocky Maninoff. Now let's go. We'll take my car.
We start off with Leonard Bernstein at 100. Leonard Bernstein, his 100th birthday is being celebrated this year.
Bernstein, 400.
Bernstein said one reason he's so connected with Gustav Mahler is both were torn between these two musical activities. Kyle.
What is composing and conducting?
You got it.
Bernstein, 800.
Performing Beethoven in Berlin in 1989, Bernstein rewrote this section of the Ninth Symphony as the Ode to Freedom. Kyle.
What is the Ode to Joy?
Yes.
Bernstein, 16.
Conducting Maria Callas in Medea in 1953, Lenny triumphed as the first American to conduct at this Milan venue. First American to conduct at La Scala.
Bernstein, 2000.
Bernstein gave his last concert in 1990 at this Massachusetts festival site where he had studied 50 years before. Kyle?
What is Tanglewood?
Yep.
Well, I think Kyle knew most of the answers there, but the fact that Jeopardy would run a set of questions about him at that point, and that the Flintstones, of course, the arbiter of all popular culture, would involve Leonard. What did they call him? Not Bernstone, I think was his name. Let me just take a moment with you all to just quickly introduce you to the syllabus. This is at the bottom of the letter that I sent you earlier this week, or late last week, and it's also on the website. So today, A Life in Music, and we're going through decade by decade, looking at pieces and writings. Then next week, Leonard Bernstein and the words of others. Third week, Leonard Bernstein as conductor. Then we'll deal with him as a teacher. Then I thought as a stage composer, we'll break it up for his writing for theater, one as a stage composer, and then writing for film, and also writing for concerts. And then what we were just talking about, our next to the last session will be about Leonard Bernstein being so attuned as a composer and conductor, attuned to the music of others, and how he encouraged younger composers and conductors. We want to spend time with that. And then finally, as we conclude in 8 sessions from now, we're going to look at Leonard Bernstein and his place in the greater society. So let's continue on with our looking at the life of Leonard Bernstein in decades. By the 1970s, his marriage was in deep trouble. It began in sort of 1976 when he decided that he could no longer conceal his sexuality. He left his wife Felicia for quite a period of time, and he moved in to live with Tom Cothran, who was the classical music director of KKHI here in San Francisco. The next year, Felicia was diagnosed with lung cancer, and Leonard moved back in with her and cared for her until she died in 1978. He's reported to have spoken often of terrible guilt over his wife's death and his lack of presence in her life. And most biographies then talk about the fact that his lifestyle became more excessive and his personal behavior really actually cruder after her death. But the 1970s, amidst all of this, saw an amazing amount of production. We had a Broadway show, 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. We have Mass written for the Kennedy Center in 1971. We have his Harvard lectures in 72. We have a ballet with Jerry Robbins in 1974. And I want to introduce you to the Norton Lectures at Harvard. In 1971, he was invited to become the Charles Eliot Norton Professor of Poetry at Harvard. It was a one-year position. It had previously been held by such notable figures as Igor Stravinsky and Aaron Copland, by E.E. Cummings, W.H. Auden. And the professorship required of Bernstein that he live on campus for a whole school year, that he counsel students, and most important, that he deliver a series of 6 public lectures. Now, he was a Harvard man himself, and he was pleased and honored, I think, to become a part of this sort of distinguished tradition. And the lectures embraced always a really wide variety of disciplines, so it was a challenge for him to kind of organize his ideas into a progression of 6 talks, and every word had to be written out and memorized because each lecture was presented twice, once live at the university and then in a taping session for television. So I want to share with you a little bit from the 5th lecture, which is entitled The 20th Century Crisis. And he in this lecture tries to outline sort of the movement away from tonal music that we had up until the beginning, early parts of the 19th century. And this new mode of writing music where all the notes were equal, there was no tonal center, best exemplified for him in the music of Arnold Schoenberg. Here is a part of his lecture about Schoenberg and the new music that he is trying to promulgate.
For all these reasons, some new system had to be found, a new system for controlling the amorphousness of free-floating atonality. And so Schoenberg gradually evolved his famous serial method. Gradually. Already before this, in his Opus 19, which is a set of piano pieces, he was already veering toward a concept of the 12 chromatic tones, whereby they are all used constantly, but with no particular tonal relationship to one another. You understand what I mean? It's like the first piece of this set, which begins like this. Now, in the course of those two bars, all 12 tones are indeed employed, but there's still a ghost of tonality hanging over them. See, the chromaticism is still, just barely, but still contained. Listen to the melody alone. Perfectly tonal. In fact, it outlines a B major triad. Right? With this one, not very startling, appoggiatura, which resolves as conventionally as in Mozart or Mahler. In fact, it sounds rather like Till Eulenspiegel, doesn't it? And as it continues, the chromatic wandering is not very different from the Berlioz Romeo and Juliet music we heard last week. It still suggests B major, right? Where the difference lies is in the accompaniment, which has nothing at all to do with B major. And now listen how it goes on. What is resonating in that phrase? Do you remember Tristan? And now listen to Schoenberg. Son of Tristan. Or is it Tristan rides again? I think maybe Tristan's revenge. But whichever it is, there's still no escaping the past. The need for a control system is pressingly clear. You see that. And so, by the early 1920s, Schoenberg had arrived at a 12-tone system which guaranteed, or your money back, that you would never slip into old tonal habits. No more B major, no more Tristan, and more important, that any piece you wrote could be consistent, could make sense formally and stylistically from beginning to end. In other words, aesthetic order had been restored.
Here we're encountering the incredible intelligence of this man. To think this through and to present it in a way that makes it not just palatable to a public, but understandable to a public. On the other hand, these lectures are heavy going. They are published in a book, and they're also available on DVD. So if you really want to get into the thickness of Leonard Bernstein's mind, the Harvard lectures are a beautiful way to go. By contrast, at the same period of time, he was writing another musical. This was with Alan Lerner, who wrote the book, and it examined the establishment of the White House and its occupants from about 1800 to 1900, and it focused primarily on race relations. It depicted Thomas Jefferson's alleged affair with a black slave, James Monroe's refusal to stop slavery in Washington, the aftermath of the Civil War, Andrew Johnson's impeachment. It opened on May the 4th, 1976, and closed on May the 8th, 1976, after 7 performances and 13 previews. And to this day, it's not performed. The Bernstein estate is controlling the licensing of any performances of this, or there's a cantata version, and they refuse to allow the original musical on the stage. There's one beautiful aria song in the middle. Take care of this house, and it means the White House.
Take care of this house, If someone makes off with a dream, the dream will be yours. Take care of this house, be always on call. For this house is the hope of us all. Take care of this house, keep it from harm. If bandits break in, sound the alarm. Care for this house, shine it by hand, and keep it so clean the glow can be seen all over the land. Be careful at night, check all the doors. If someone makes off with the dream will be yours. Take care of this house, be always on call. For this house, it's the hope of us
The one song that has survived from 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. So we're in the 70s, and they're a totally contrasting work that Bernstein composes in the 1970s is a piece called Dybbuk. Now, in Jewish folklore, as my understanding, a dybbuk is a kind of wandering soul which can enter into a living person and talk through the mouth of that person and sort of present us with a separate or an alien personality. This is based on a play by Ansky, was a sort of a nom de plume of Solomon Rappaport, who was a 19th century Russian author. And the story is about two young lovers who've secretly been pledged to each other before their births by the oaths of their father. But the pledge gets broken by the girl's father, who betroths her to another. So the boy, in despair, kind of dabbles in black arts, and he becomes a dybbuk, and he enters the body of his beloved. This is a ballet done, again, in collaboration with the great choreographer Jerome Robbins. Jack Gottlieb wrote a fascinating book called Working with Bernstein. He worked very closely with him for almost 50 years. And he talks about this piece in the following way. He says, if I had to select one piece of his from the Bernstein catalog, this would be my desert island choice. Alas, mine is not an enthusiasm much shared by others, which I find incomprehensible. For me, the score displays the skill, the imagination of a composer at the peak of his powers. Take a listen to a little bit of Dybbuk. Well, Dorothy, we're not in Kansas anymore. We're not at West Side Story or even Candide. Here is Bernstein. The premiere was in 1974 with the New York City Ballet. Here is Bernstein again telling story. And in this sense, going back to this ancient folklore, Jewish folklore. And he goes and pulls many of the folk song idioms that are to be found there, and a lot of the Talmudic deliberations are sort of hidden inside this. I must say, it makes me want to see the ballet. 1970s with Leonard Bernstein. We move on now to the 1980s. And just a couple of pieces here, one of which I want to spend a little bit of time on. First of all, he wrote another opera. This is called The Quiet Place. And this is a sequel. This was written in 1983. This is a sequel to Trouble in Tahiti, which was written in 1951. And if you can remember an hour ago, we talked about it, about this young couple who were in this sad, sad marriage. Well, they're still there, and they live in a small white suburban house, which is a very quiet place. But it's wonderful to put the two pieces together. And actually now, frequently, Trouble in Tahiti is shortened and serves as another act of this opera, A Quiet Place. But the piece I would like to spend just a few moments on is a piece called Halil, which was composed and premiered in 1981. Halil is from the Hebrew word for flute. It was written in memory of a very bright 19-year-old Israeli flutist named Yadin Tenenbaum. And Yadin was killed in his tank in the Sinai at the onset of the 1973 Yom Kippur War. Here's what Leonard Bernstein wrote about it. He says, Halil is formally unlike any other work I have written, but is like much of my music, and here we go again, in its struggle between tonal and non-tonal forces. In this case, I sense that struggle as involving wars or the threats of wars. And that is set against the overwhelming desire to live and the consolations of art and love and the hope for peace. So again, if you take nothing away from today, hopefully you're seeing this constant dialectic in his life, in the choices that he tried to make, but in his composing and in a sense, as we will discover later on, in his conducting. Here's Paula Robeson with the New England Conservatory Ensemble playing a little bit from Halil. What a beautiful memorial to this young Israeli flautist, Yadin Tannenbaum. This is a piece that I really relate to. There is a quiet, gentle beauty, and yet it's thoroughly modern. Well, the 1980s brought lots of changes in Leonard Bernstein's life as he aged and his health began to deteriorate. A couple of years before his death, we find him in Berlin, at the point of the fall of the wall around East Berlin. And here we encounter Leonard Bernstein, the world citizen. Here you see him hacking away at that wall with a chisel, and he hacked away at so many of our cultural walls that tend to surround us, and he was able, to break them down and to move through them. Humphrey Burton, who wrote this wonderful, wonderful book, which I will refer you to next week, about Bernstein, he says this about that occasion on December 25th, 1989. The occasion, which took place in East Berlin's Schauspielhaus as a part of a celebration of the fall of the Berlin Wall. And the festive Berlin performances really marked a kind of climax to the public life of the world citizen, Leonard Bernstein. And under Leonard Bernstein, there were combined choirs and orchestras. They all gave more than a concert. They lit a torch for the love of freedom and the longing for freedom that extended far beyond that occasion. Outside the theater on the plaza, thousands of spectators, quietly and emotionally moved, watched with bated breath this musical event televised from the hall. Leonard Bernstein, Beethoven's scepter in his hand, joining in the call for freedom, where he changes the word Freude to Freiheit, from joy to freedom. So with the 1990s, we enter the last decade, and only a few years of that decade of Leonard Bernstein's life. On August 19th of 1990, he announced his retirement from conducting. So on the 19th of August, on the 9th of October, he died. He died of a heart attack, which was brought on apparently by mesothelioma. He was only 72 years old. He was a long-time heavy smoker, and he had had emphysema since his mid-50s. But he quoted at the end of his last concert, which you see the program, he played Britain. He went all the way back to his conducting of Peter Grimes, played the C interludes from Benjamin Britten's Peter Grimes and the Beethoven 7th Symphony. And he wrote afterwards, he said, "You know, it's incredible how I did my first concert at Tanglewood and I did my last concert at Tanglewood. There's a real sense of closure there." And on the day of his funeral, the procession sort of wound its way through many of the streets of Manhattan, and construction workers removed their hats and waved, calling out, "Goodbye, Lenny." He was buried in Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn in New York next to his wife, and with a copy of Mahler's Fifth Symphony opened to the famous Adagietto lying across his heart. He said this about his life that I read just recently, as he was looking ahead in his life, but it so explains him towards the end. "I don't want to give in and settle for some specialty. I don't want to spend the rest of my life as Toscanini did, studying and restudying, say, 50 pieces of music. It would bore me to death. I want to conduct. I want to play the piano. I want to write music for Broadway and Hollywood. I want to write music for symphonies. I want to keep on trying to be, in the full sense of that wonderful word, trying to be a musician. I want to teach. I want to write books and poetry, and I think I can and still do justice to them all."
Towards the end of his life, all the things he felt insufficient about or not realized, he would take out on the music and sometimes stretch it to a point beyond the limits that it could reach.
His interpretation changed, it grew. Very often the tempos were slower. I think he didn't want the pieces to end. He just didn't want to let go.
after that evening, we're sitting there, and he says, you know, that's full circle. I did my first major concert at Tanglewood, and I did my last. And I believe it was 50 years.
I think everybody in that place sensed that was it. And sure enough, I think it was a day or two later, it was announced that he would do no more conducting. And pretty soon after that, he died.
None of us thought Lenny would ever die. He was meant to just live forever.
His music is intensely autobiographical, so the pieces do reflect his early, middle, and late years in that way of, optimistic, reflective, and then concerned, sort of almost desperate that all of the disparate themes will somehow come out in the end, that there will be some kind of resolution and peace. And that word peace was so important to him. When he talked about world peace, when he talked about music bringing you peace, or even the idea of a quiet place, it was always that hope that somehow there would be a quiet sleep, a slumber in which there would be no nightmares, the hopes of an insomniac that there will be this last sleep where he can smile and be proud of all that he's done.
In the beginning was the note, and the note was with God. And whosoever can reach for that note, reach high and bring it back to us on earth, to our earthly ears. He is a composer, and to the extent of his reach, partakes of the divine.
And so we come to the end of our first session together. I hope that in organizing by decades, that it's given us a bit of a handle on his personal life. It's given us a context for our study of the man, of his music, of his place in history and in the culture, particularly of the Western world. That we've had a little bit of a sampling of some of his own writing, and certainly that we've had a sampling of his works. We've listened to his symphonic work in the Jeremiah Symphony, chamber works such as the Clarinet Sonata and Halil. We've certainly looked at his theater music on the town, Candide, Dybbuk, even 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. We've looked at his teaching on television and how he was such a pioneer with the Young People's Concerts, Young Persons Concerts, and the Omnibus series with the New York Philharmonic. We've seen his intellectual thinking side with those Norton lectures. We've listened to a little bit of choral works with Chichester Psalms, and we've gotten a bit of a touch of his ability to reach into the music of other composers and to present them in a way that is powerful and meaningful. Next week, we go to Leonard Bernstein in the words of others. I thank you for your attention today. It's been great to be with you, and I look forward to next week. Thank you, everyone. Have a good week.